Welcome to The Explainer. Today we're diving right into a recent and honestly highly charged Fox News discussion that tackles a major cultural debate head-on. Now, our goal here isn't to take sides. We're basically acting as your objective tour guides through the arguments this panel presents. We'll be deconstructing their claims about an alleged rise in progressive activism within major American institutions, specifically looking at the Smithsonian and the broader public education system. We're going to map out exactly how they build their case so you can clearly understand the core issues driving this intense national conversation.
Okay, let's dive into this. Here is our agenda. 1. The Culture War Explained. 2. Activism at the Smithsonian. 3. Crisis in public schools. 4. The Mississippi Miracle. And 5. The Battle for Values.
Section 1. The Culture War Explained. A deliberate shift.
So, to really grasp this segment, we first need to look at it through the panel's lens. They aren't looking at these things as isolated incidents, right? The foundational premise, which was introduced strongly by Speaker Charlie Hurt, is that this shift away from foundational values is absolutely not an accident. Hurt explicitly states that this ideological movement is, quote, all very, very intentional. The speakers argue there's a coordinated effort to fundamentally change the historical narrative and the foundational principles of the United States. This idea of deliberate intention, that is the glue holding all of their subsequent arguments together.
Section 2. Activism at the Smithsonian. Defunding threats. The panel applies this premise of intentionality straight to their first major battleground, the Smithsonian institution. According to the broadcast, this perceived shift has actually escalated to the point where Republican lawmakers are now threatening the museum's federal funding. The panel references a new report by a former colleague named Vince, claiming it exposes woke content. They express deep concern that the museum is actively wiping away the Founding Fathers and Christianity, elements they view as unifying traditional history.
Now, what's really interesting here is the stark contrast the panel draws between unifying history and what they deem to be inappropriate activism. On one side, they point to traditional history, things like the Founding Fathers, Christianity, and the First Lady's Dresses exhibit, which Speaker Kayleigh McEnany actually fondly recalls from her own youth. On the other side, they list the report's findings regarding LGBTQ+ content, like Diaries of a Transitioning Youth, crotch harnesses, and exhibits placing Mickey Mouse in a racial context. For the panel, that first side represents history that unifies us, while the latter, that represents divisive activism.
And that brings us to this incredibly high-impact quote from Kayleigh McEnany, which perfectly sums up their stance. This is not American history. This is activism. She goes on to compare the museum's current direction to the New York Times, suggesting both are engaged in a deliberate endeavor to wipe away the foundation of America and completely change history. The panel firmly believes that spending $1 billion on these museums should result in national pride, not what they describe as ahistorical activism.
Section 3. Crisis in public schools. Ideology versus literacy.
Moving from the national stage, the panel transitions down to the local level, our public education system. They directly reference a pretty stark New York Post cover asking a chilling question: why can't our kids read? They voice serious alarm over statistics indicating that less than half of students can even pass basic English. For the panel, you see, this isn't just a funding issue or some bureaucratic failure. It represents a catastrophic breakdown in teaching basic literacy.
The panel lays out a very specific set of grievances regarding this crisis. They place heavy blame squarely on teachers' unions, specifically calling out Randy Weingarten for pushing activism on steroids. On top of that, they argue schools are inappropriately prioritizing gender ideology. They point to a focus on youth transgender surgeries and the deliberate withholding of transition information from absentee parents. Their overarching claim here is that schools have essentially traded basic education for intense indoctrination.
So the crucial point is how Charlie Hart connects this lack of education right back to their overarching premise of intentionality. He argues that failing to teach basic literacy is actually a deliberate tactic. His logic goes like this. If you don't teach children how to read, well, they can't pick up a history book to discover the truth for themselves. Instead, they're forced to simply take the activist word for it. By crumbling basic education, he argues, activists can completely control the historical narrative.
Section 4. The Mississippi Miracle. Looking at the science.
But the segment doesn't just focus on the problems, they actually propose an empirical counterexample. They point to the number 10, highlighting what's known as the Mississippi Miracle. They note that Mississippi has jumped from being ranked 49th in education all the way up into the top 10. And they offer high praise for similar educational reforms taking place in conservative states like Louisiana and Alabama, which are successfully improving literacy.
In a rather surprising pivot,
The panel strongly suggests that progressive New York lawmakers, specifically naming Zohran Mamdani, should actually request a meeting with Mississippi's Governor Tate Reeves to study these successes. It's an unexpected piece of advice for sure, but instead of handing out what the panel calls A's in LGBTQ and trans, they argue lawmakers need to prioritize the actual science of education that is demonstrably working in these conservative states.
Section 5. The battle for values, the ultimate goal. And this brilliantly illustrates the climax of their argument. The panel asserts there is a deliberate effort behind this activism. The ultimate goal, they argue, isn't inclusion at all. It's to use the 8 hours children are in the school system every day to intentionally confuse them and separate them from their parental values, specifically their parents' Christian values. By severing that parental bond, the panel argues, the system can successfully turn these kids into little activists. To really hammer this point home, the speaker shares some final, highly charged anecdotes. They describe a shocking incident at a New York public school performance where, instead of learning about history, the kids allegedly stormed the parent. They also express serious outrage over the existence of rainbow reading rooms designed specifically for kindergartners. To the panel, this is direct evidence that schools are actively working to indoctrinate children at the absolute youngest possible age. To accurately reflect the deep emotional intensity of the broadcast, we really have to share these final quotes. When discussing these ideologies being pushed onto 5-year-olds, the panel uses severe rhetoric. They call it deeply destructive, they venture to say it's demonic, and they outright label it child abuse. This kind of language underscores exactly how high the panel believes the stakes are in this cultural battle. Which leaves us with this final, vital question. How will this deep ideological divide over tradition, education, and parental rights ultimately reshape the foundation of American institutions? As we've seen, for the panel, this isn't just a debate about museum funding or reading scores. It's a profound clash over the country's Christian heritage and the values that will define its future, with the speakers framing these cultural shifts as a destructive departure from foundational principles. Thanks so much for joining me for this explainer, and I encourage you to keep looking critically at how these arguments continue to unfold